Hello, political theorists. Welcome to part 2 of my lecture on Aristotle and the purpose of government, and it's the longer half. Okay, we left Aristotle last time having established, at least in his mind, that the true end, or telos, of human life is eudaimonia, or the good life. Now Aristotle launches into trying to establish how individuals might achieve that good life. If this feels a little like the beginning of a self-help book to you, you're probably not alone in this. But the road to eudaimonia is where things start getting political. Aristotle's blueprint to achieving happiness is the cultivation of virtue. And here, this has echoes of Socrates, where the happy person also seems to be the good person, and these two people are ultimately going to be identical. All right, what is virtue? Virtues are attitudes and disposition. You might call them stable aspects of a person's character that are conducive to living a good life. The good life, in other words, is not something that just happens to you, but it's something that you live and that you work at. It's not so much a state of affairs as much as kind of an activity. And this activity has to be regulated by the virtues. So what kind of virtues does Aristotle think will help us achieve eudaimonia? Well, here's a list. It's not an exhaustive list, but it gives you an idea of the kinds of classical virtues that Aristotle has in mind. Prudence, justice, temperance, courage, magnanimity, liberality, which means generosity, gentleness, wisdom. But what makes these things virtues? I've just listed a bunch of attitudes and character dispositions. They all sound nice, but being a virtue isn't just about being nice. What makes something a virtue is that it helps us achieve eudaimonia within a community of other people. In other words, there's a real relational aspect to the virtues. One wouldn't need all these virtues if we lived alone, but we can't do that. In particular, one key aspect of Aristotle's thought is that eudaimonia is not something that can be achieved in splendid isolation from other people. We need to live around others in order to live a good human life. The good human life is not achieved on a desert island. Indeed, a great quote from Aristotle is that he who is unable to live in society, or who has no need because he is sufficient for himself, must either be a beast or a god. Right? Think about that for a minute. Beasts and gods do not need other people, but human beings most certainly do. All right, let's talk about what makes something a virtue. For example, think about something like courage. Courage is a virtue because overcoming fear is necessary to protect yourself and others from threats. All societies need defenders, and if a society was full of cowards, presumably they wouldn't be capable of defending themselves from potential aggression. Now, courage of a different sort is probably needed to share uncomfortable truths, or to reveal one's feelings, or to defend one's convictions. For some people, to speak in public. In a modern context, courage is also needed to start a business or attempt an education. And its opposite, cowardice, is a vice because a community full of cowards makes it harder for anyone to reach eudaimonia. Now, thinking a little bit further on the idea of virtue, for Aristotle, people are not naturally courageous. In other words, virtues are not something that people are born with. They're things that are cultivated. You can be naturally fearless, but you can't be naturally courageous, because courageous involves overcoming fear. And overcoming fear is a learned behavior. It's something that is forced, that it's uncomfortable, that in some ways is not natural, in the sense that it's not instinctual always. Courage is something that has to be cultivated through forcing oneself repeatedly, according to Aristotle, to face and overcome one's fears. Aristotle thinks that over time, individuals can cultivate courage, or they can fail to. And failing to do so is itself morally blameworthy. In addition to cultivating personal courage, people can also cultivate norms of courage that encourage others to be brave, and that stigmatize cowardice. In other words, the cultivation of a brave people isn't just an individual matter, but it's a social matter. It's a question of culture. It's a question of maintaining a certain set of norms about what is appropriate conduct, or in this case, what is appropriate, what is an appropriate character disposition to have. And this is where government enters our story, because the cultivation of virtue is ultimately a collective thing. Government ultimately is called into action here. Human beings are not born with virtue. We've said that already. Virtue is inculcated through social transmission, and for Aristotle, the state, or the polis, is instrumental in crafting laws that help people cultivate virtue. And Aristotle isn't so clear about what those laws look like, but I think the general outlines will become visible. Now, one thing that's interesting here is that Aristotle doesn't draw a sharp distinction between society and state, and that would be something that would have been fairly common 2,500 years ago. Thinking about the state as an organization, a governmental structure, versus thinking about society as a whole, a lot of the times there wasn't that functional separation. It's not that it didn't exist; it's people didn't really conceptualize it very much. So for him, it was just kind of a given that public culture was something that the state should try to direct. Indeed, we'll look at the tale of the Crito later on, where Socrates is put to death, and one of the things that Socrates is put to death for is essentially for questioning the public culture and the public mythology of Athens. And that was something that the state took very, very seriously. Okay, so human beings, according to Aristotle, if they fail to cultivate virtue, if they are vicious, if they have lots of vices, vicious means something different here, right? It means non-virtuous. It doesn't mean being mean, right? When we say a vicious dog, that means the dog's mean. In this case, for Aristotle, a dog would be incapable of being virtuous because a dog can't cultivate character dispositions. Anyway, point being, vicious here means prone to vice. And if they fail to cultivate virtue, human beings are generally going to be prone to various excesses, particularly excesses of appetites, passions, appetites for sex, for power, for glory, for food. Without virtue to help moderate those kinds of appetites, we become more beast-like. And what that does is if we're like that, if we're vicious, that harms us and it harms people around us. It prevents not just ourselves from achieving a good life, because it creates all kinds of conflict, right? So if you're constantly trying to hit on your neighbor's wife, you're constantly trying to exercise power over people, you're constantly seeking all the attention and glory, right? That's going to create conflict in your friend circle and ultimately in your society. And it's going to prevent not just you from being happy because other people are going to resist you, but it also is going to prevent them from being happy. So in other words, the cultivation of vice is a social problem. And although you might think, well, it's just my character, it's just how I am. I get angry, I get horny, I lust for power. But no, that's not just how you are. It's something that ultimately spreads out to all the people around you. And so virtue is clearly cast here as a balancing quality. Reason tells us to use virtue to dominate our urges towards excess, and it's a kind of picture of human nature here that's being developed, right? Where we're reasoning creatures and we're creatures with appetites, and our task to live well is to balance our reason with our appetites in order to be able to live with one another and get everything we need from society. It's worth pausing here for a minute for a digression on the distinction between Aristotle's classical view of virtue and how that's different from some Christian or ascetic understandings of virtue. Remember, for Aristotle, virtue lies in balance or moderation. Moderation here is the key good, not self-denial, right? So for Aristotle, some sex is good, some pleasure is good, some generosity is good, some self-sacrifice is good, but an excess of all those things it turns out not to be good. Whereas in other traditions, Christian, but again, other ascetic traditions, including the ancient Stoic tradition, virtue, up to and including sainthood, is understood as being an extreme of some of these characters, right? Total chastity, total self-sacrifice, total altruism, total self-denial, right? The people who are praised by those traditions are not people who exercise moderation, These are people who live kind of in the extremes. And Aristotle is not at all like that. Like his view is diametrically opposite. Um, okay, back to politics. The need for people to be virtuous in order for the whole community to be able to achieve eudaimonia is a deep kind of moral interdependence. You've probably studied the idea of interdependence if you've taken international politics. But in this sense, right, we are morally interdependent. Our happiness is, in some ways, ultimately interdependent. In other words, everybody else has to have a good character so that their excesses don't spill over and create misery for me. So this leads to an insight about the role of government. Governments are not just trying to take an interest in what you do, but also have to take an interest in what kind of person you are. In that sense, the government, one analogy is sort of, they're partly your parent, right? Your mom or your dad. They're taking an interest in who you are. Not just trying to correct your behavior, but also trying to inculcate certain habits of mind in you, certain attitudes and dispositions. Or maybe you could see the government as a kind of therapist, right? Again, someone who's deeply interested in correcting bad patterns of behavior so that you can be happier and so that you can make the people around you happier as well. So the government for Aristotle can't just restrict itself to trying to regulate behavior, because whether we live the good life or not depends on countless decisions by countless people in both their private and their public lives. Indeed, if you think about it, the aim of politics for Aristotle can't be just the formulation of rules, because the tendency to obey rules itself is a product of a person's virtue. A vicious person will stop following the rules as soon as no one's watching. So it's not sufficient to have good rules. You have to have good character so that people will actually either follow the rule or perhaps in some case know when to break the rule. Okay. Now, my students are always somewhat horrified at Aristotle's idea of government because it seems like he licenses the government to brainwash citizens and to make them fit into a particular mold and determine who they are as human beings. And that strikes them as horribly intrusive of their privacy and their freedom of conscience. Aristotle seems a little totalitarian on this view, where government seems to be able to claim to rule your mind as well as your actions. And I think there might be some truth to this sort of Orwellian vision of Aristotle, but I think Aristotle would respond in the following way. If we're going to be fair to him, we have to sort of imagine how he might respond to those kinds of criticisms. And I think he might say something like this. He might ask you to consider how much more government is needed to constantly monitor and check on individual behavior, and then punish that behavior when it becomes obnoxious or deviant to the rule. He said all of that is necessary because you're ignoring character development. Because you're failing to help citizens cultivate their virtue, the government then has to do a lot more work on the back end with an extensive prison system, a large police force, a surveillance state, and a law book full of detailed rules and regulations and penalties. And it has to do all of that because the government didn't take a proactive role in inculcating good attitudes and dispositions in its citizens. A successful character education would, in other words, reduce the need for a very large government. And if you think about it, ancient Athens had no police force, no massively detailed legal code, and hardly any prison cells. So that's at least anecdotal support for that sort of view. In other words, Aristotle would respond that a big overbearing government is precisely the price you have to pay for leaving virtue up to the flawed private judgment of each citizen. Another reason that Aristotle doesn't see civic and moral education by the state as a threat to freedom, the way my students sometimes do, I think is that his understanding of freedom is not the one most Americans or Westerners are familiar with. Freedom for Aristotle is very much understood as a kind of autonomy or self-mastery. We tend to see freedom as the absence of impediment, that is to say, absence of external interference with my actions, or perhaps as the realization of my, or absence, or being left alone sometimes. But for Aristotle, freedom really means choice. And choice in this sense means control, and control not just over your environment, but control over yourself. In other words, the person who has irrepressible bouts of anger is not a person who's free. Just like a drug addict is not free. even though nobody's preventing them or telling them what to do. The drug addict is very much not free. The person who is prone to anger is not free. The person who is depressed is not free. That's a problem that we face often in modern society. It seems to be an increasing problem, depression. And Aristotle would say depression is a threat to freedom because ultimately an individual is not in control of their own moods, is not in control of their own minds. Okay, so most Westerners probably see threats to their freedom as being external to themselves, right? If you ask Americans to list the main threats to their freedom, they'd probably list in order the government, their bosses, their employers, maybe the market. But Aristotle was equally worried about internal threats. He's not saying that these external threats aren't a problem, aren't a threat to freedom. They are. But he's equally worried about the threat that individuals pose to themselves, and he thinks most people underrate those threats. They don't see it. They're blind to the thing that their character dispositions and their appetites and their they think that those are things that they can't control, whereas Aristotle thinks that with time we can cultivate moderating virtues, and that these appetites and these passions are internal threats to a person's freedom. So people are a threat to themselves, and they're prone to excesses. And these excesses, once again, I'm repeating myself here, but they don't just harm them, but they inevitably spill over and harm the people around them. He would say something like, well, your own bad character is getting in the way of you and the people around you living a good human life. Again, this sounds suspiciously like a self-help book you might find on the shelf in Borders, but I think that everybody recognizes, I think most people recognize that there's at least some truth here, right? That some people are their own worst enemy. And some people, by failing to exercise control over themselves, do in fact end up making everybody miserable, including themselves. So for Aristotle, to truly be free, you have to take control over yourself too. So the problem of good government for Aristotle at the end of the day is trying to create a kind of virtuous cycle. And the virtuous cycle functions roughly this way. If the people are virtuous, then they will make good decisions. They've got good character, dispositions, they make good decisions. They'll put virtuous leaders in place and accept the decisions of virtuous leaders. If leaders and decision makers are virtuous, the laws will tend to be good. That is to say, the laws will tend to, among other things, inculcate virtue. And if the laws are good, then the people will continue to be virtuous. Once the people are virtuous, then they will continue to put their trust in virtuous leaders, and the cycle continues. You can see how this is a kind of cycle where one thing feeds into the other. And of course, you could also imagine a vicious cycle, right, where you have bad people or vicious people who can't tell the difference between good and bad leaders, and so they put bad leaders in place. Those bad leaders make bad laws, which reinforce the vicious tendencies of the people, and the people continue to be vicious and continue to elect vicious leaders, or at least perhaps not be able to tell the difference, and so on and so forth. And sometimes I must say that in democracies, it often feels that way, where we have citizens that are not particularly educated or thinking terribly clearly, who elect people who put bad laws in place, and those laws tend to reinforce the bad habits the people already have. At least to me, it doesn't seem totally insane. Now, although this virtuous cycle is ideal, most constitutions studied by Aristotle, and Aristotle in the Politics ends up spending a lot of time sort of dissecting different kinds of constitutions that he could observe at his time. And I'm not going to go over all of that, although it makes for interesting reading. But he notes that many of the constitutions he studies seem prone to particular problems. And he thought that this had to do with the kinds of, with who was in control and what their characteristic excesses were. And that if those excesses weren't checked by that form of government, the form of government would ultimately devolve into something kind of ugly. And of course, he has a whole table of sort of ideal forms of government and their corrupted forms. And he thought that if those governments were unchecked, then we would often get the corrupted form. Anyway, so he classifies governments by the people who are in charge, right? So democracies have ordinary people in charge. Actually, democracy he sees as the perverted form. I forget exactly what the pure form of democracy is, but either the people can be in charge, or the rich can be in charge, or kings, and I think he really means warriors, the military, can be in charge. Right? Those are the different forms of government that he observes around him, and he says each of those forms of government is prone to characteristic problems. Right? Uh, so democracies where the people rule, um, people have excessive ignorance, right? The people who rule tend to be uneducated, and they have excessive appetites. They're not able to control themselves very well. Aristocrats also have some excessive appetites, but for different things. Not so much food and sex, but wealth and honor. And then warriors have their own excessive appetites. They want glory. They want power. And if unchecked, then you're going to get characteristic excesses from that kind of government. And Aristotle thought, okay, and this is a very typical Aristotelian strategy. He sees all these excesses and he says, okay, we need to balance this stuff out. And so his ideal politeia, right, which is his ideal form of government, ends up giving a little bit of power to all three in the hopes that the excesses of each social class is checked by the other ones. And this looks a little bit like checks and balances, but we're not talking about branches of government here. We're talking about segments of society. Okay, so contemporary relevance. Let's talk about the American founding. We live in a republic that was founded by people who were intimately familiar with Aristotle, intimately familiar, and had a lot of respect for Aristotle. They didn't adopt wholly Aristotelian ideas, but Aristotle exercises both a direct and an indirect influence. A direct influence because people like Thomas Jefferson and James Madison had certainly read Aristotle. It was part of an important classical education at the time. And of course, the people that they read, people like Locke and Montesquieu, themselves had been steeped in Aristotle, were very familiar with Aristotle. So even to the extent that they were reacting against Aristotle, they were still influenced by him and the problems that he brought to the table. And one of the problems that they brought to the table was that, and the problem they took very seriously, was that unchecked democracy would be a disaster, right? Everybody at that time thought that more democracy wasn't always a good thing. Some public input was a necessary thing, but that unchecked democracy would be disastrous. A second thing that they all believed, and they all seemed to believe very strongly, was that virtue was essential to the success of a republic. That is to say that a republic and freedom would not survive very long if people were not virtuous, and if we couldn't find a way to keep people virtuous. Some of the institutional ways in which these ideas were expressed include things like the indirect election of presidents and the indirect election of senators, state-level property requirements for voting. These are all kind of aristocratic elements to the original American Constitution. These are elements that actually have been removed. Our Constitution has become much more democratic since it was ratified. But for many people at the time, these aristocratic elements were seen as necessary. Again, the public culture has changed. I think public opinions has changed significantly, but it's a testament to the influence of Aristotle that in some ways that is how our Constitution started out. It's also, speaking of the founders, one piece that I really how should I put this? One really interesting part of early American legislation was the Northwest Ordinance of 1787. It's one of the few sort of documents where Congress explains what it's trying to do, along with the Constitution. And one thing that the Northwest Ordinance states is the following. Religion, morality, and knowledge being necessary to good government and the happiness of mankind, schools and the means of education shall forever be encouraged. And then the Northwest Ordinance goes on and reserves some part of each settled area for a school. In other words, the plots of land are kind of divvied out, but one plot of land is always reserved for a school. It can't be turned into housing or something else. So, and what's really interesting about this statement is you can see how education, morality, good governance, and happiness are all closely tied together, right? And again, this is a very Aristotelian kind of view where education for morality, that morality feeds into good governance, and that good governance and morality make for a happy human life. And I think, I don't know if they were explicitly thinking about Aristotle, but I think their education and their having read Aristotle probably influenced their views in this area. All right. In conclusion, and I realize this has been a long video. In addition to influencing American political thought and constitutionalism, I think Aristotle continues to be relevant to a large number of contemporary debates, including, but not limited to, government paternalism, right? Things like drug laws, seatbelt laws, government information campaigns, right? Where the government tries to persuade you to stop smoking or to stop drinking soda. Public education, right? How much public education should government do, and what kind of public education should government do? Should government just teach reading, writing, and arithmetic, or should there be a value component to public education? In other words, should the government be trying to make you braver, more charitable, more generous, right? Inculcating these kinds of virtues. Third, questions about democracy, questions that are fundamental to in some ways, the ways we think about our own form of government, and to what extent the people can be trusted to government, and how much limitations should be put on the power of the people. So think about things like judicial review, or checks and balances, or separations of powers. All of these things, to some extent, are limitations on sort of pure democracy, or federalism for that matter, where it separates the country into 50 little democracies instead of one big democracy, changing who the people are. Again, all of these issues, I think, are issues where Aristotle would have a lot to say. The line between what's public and what's private, right? That's something that we often worry about. Like, just taking the debates from the last year, mask mandates, abortion, right? Is the government, when people say, keep your hands off my body, don't tell me what to wear, don't tell me what to do with my body. These are public-private debates about where the line between public and private lies. And again, Aristotle has a lot to say about, well, mostly the lack of such lines. And again, many things that we haven't explored. There's many parts of Aristotle on women, on slavery, on economics and self-sufficiency and inequality. These are all areas that Aristotle has something to say about, and again, areas that we continue to debate in contemporary politics. I think we could go on forever, but this lecture cannot.